Great. Today I'm going to be showing you guys how I recreated the song I'm in Love with You by the 1975. This song actually made me pre-order the vinyl for their upcoming album. Being funny in a foreign language, I'm really excited to hear what it sounds like. I'm going to walk you through how I approach 1975 style guitar layering, mixing disco drums, and how to make your mastering chains sound more vintage. But before we jump into that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I work as a song completion producer for guitar-based pop based out of Washington State. I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to make their own pop music at home. Songs I've either written or produced have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I did an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you vibe with what I'm doing right here, and you would like to offload the production responsibilities for your next song onto somebody else, so you can just focus on being a songwriter, check my link at the top of the description. All right, now on to the rest of the video. All right, so I will work from the top down, because there's a lot of layers in this. So the first thing to look at are these acoustics. So an interesting thing about these acoustics, they are double tracked, but they're not playing the exact same thing, even though they're panned left and right. So one of them is playing more of a root position in D. But this lower guy here is actually playing chord shapes in the key of C, but with a capo on the second fret. And the two of them having this sort of syncopated rhythm where they're not really playing on the one that much. They're more of an upbeat emphasis is really interesting. Honestly, didn't do a whole lot of processing to these guys. This mix was a very experimental session for me. So some of the stuff might be pretty weird, but I don't know. I got bored with using the normal chain I use on these videos. So I used RVox to compress a bit, some Juno chorus, because it sounded to me like the guitars had a bit of chorus on them. And then the two of them are going into a bus with RC20 on it, adding a little bit of warble, dulling the tone a little bit, and then to sort of level them out / control them a bit more tonally, we're using MoTT on 25%. So with all those turned off, they sound like this. Then turned back on, they sound like this. You can tell it's not just that they're brighter or louder. They have a bit more of a vibe to them. After that, we have some electric guitar. This is the main one here. You can hear this one pretty strong in the intro. It's just kind of like a neutral pedaling tone that's kind of moving with those chord changes that the acoustics are doing. And in a weird way, all three of them together kind of sound like one instrument. But yeah, as you can see, even though you can't really hear any chord changes happening here, if you solo it, it's emphasizing those chord changes in the acoustics. In terms of a tone, I'm just using a Strat going into Corey Wong Archetype from Neural DSP. I tweaked this tone a lot. Like this is the rinse and repeat preset, and I actually turned off the reverb and the delay. And to me, it didn't sound like this had like a chorus on it. It sounded like it had a bit more of a phaser. So normally I've just been grabbing the kilohertz stuff, which is really awesome if you need like a single utility plugin that isn't really complex. You just need like a simple, like I need a phaser, I need a chorus, I need a distortion. These guys are really useful for that. Then doing a bit of EQ, cutting out a lot of the lows, doing some mid scoop stuff, and then low passing it, doing some L1 to tame those peaks. And then this is to taste. I felt like there was kind of a slap back happening, like just subtly. You may not even be able to hear it if you're listening to it on Spotify. Honestly, I've been listening to a lot of stuff on Tidal as reference because you can stream high quality FLAC files. And when you listen to this track on Tidal, there is a lot of information that you can't really hear when it's compressed down to an MP3 that's playing on Spotify. But yeah, if you're somebody who mixes from reference tracks a lot, I would highly recommend a Tidal subscription. Not sponsored, by the way. But yeah, here's what all that sounds like. I'll leave the amp plugin on. Then on. Just a little vibiness. And then we're kind of using the exact same chain for the other electric right below it. Just adjusted the EQ a little bit, since the kind of cuts and filtering you do is kind of based off of the part that you're playing. And since this one was a bit lower, I didn't really need to go as high. And again, this one is just kind of like a counterpoint thing. With this entire song, the more layers you add onto it, the more you hear that like syncopation playing off of one another. Like all of these parts are very simple, but because they're so syncopated and they're not playing the exact same rhythm, it makes it feel like a lot is happening. And you'll see that effect just kind of add on and on throughout the track. And then in the B part of the chorus, we have this guy. This is just the 80s clean and Corey Wong archetype. Very different EQ curve, L1 again. Honestly, after listening to it again, they might have done this with an acoustic. And then we have these weird guys here. So again, I had to kind of cheat for this one. If I were to replicate it perfectly with like what's on the record, I feel like I would need a mandolin and a 12 string. I don't really have those. So I decided to approximate something that I thought was the general sound using some contact stuff. So this upper plucky one is the session guitarist picked acoustic. It's the melody version, which means that you can actually just play MIDI notes on top of it. And I'm just using the basic open setting, really high up, running it into some MoTT, some chorus dimension D from Arturia. I wanted to add like a different kind of chorus, just so it wouldn't sound exactly the same as all the other choruses that I have on the track. And then I felt like using RVox because I'm messing around with stuff more. But as you can hear, it's playing another sort of distinct, simple rhythm that is syncopated that then builds on top of the track. And same thing goes for this guy down here, which I was trying to get sort of a mandolin vibe from. It's just a contact library ode, doing the same MoTT thing, using the kilohertz chorus because I wanted it to be different, and then also going into RVox. So here's what those two sound like with everything else we have so far. You can hear like so much of the mid-range elements happening in this track. They're syncopated and they're super simple, but they feel like they're adding so much movement to everything. All right, now we are getting to the synthesizers, starting with this guy. This guy was super fun the first time I heard it. It's just this sort of cascade 16th note triplet. I'm using the Annabelle preset in Anna 2, high passing and low passing with a little bit of a mid scoop to control it, some L1 to get the volume leveled out. And then after I was listening on Tidal, it felt like there was a bit more of an oomph behind it. Like it wasn't a purely high-end detail thing. So I actually added some R bass to it, which excites that fundamental in the low end, which sounds like it wouldn't really work, but I felt like it did. And then we're using a little bit of auto pan just at 60% to sort of get that sort of cascading from side to side happening. It's not at 100% because I felt like that was too disorienting. You almost want to get this sort of rainbow effect happening on the sides of your head. And then, by the way, I should also mention a lot of these are going to sends. The first one is the one that's my go-to, which is this ROM reverb from Native Instruments. And then a .8 ping pong delay using the Waves H delay. This is like the most basic delay plugin that I have ever used, and yet I keep coming back to it just because this user interface is so simple and super practical. And then we have these guys down here, which are just adding a bit of mid-range beef. I felt like just the acoustics hitting that pattern didn't have enough meat on it when we hit to the chorus. So these guys are just lightly blended in underneath that. So the top is this June V6 from the Arturia V collection on the Celesta preset with the release turned down a lot. Also, whenever I use this plugin, I'm almost always turning off this coarse noise. I get that it's like traditional Juno things, but I always hate hearing it. So be sure to turn off this coarse noise. On some level, I'm really happy that they like allow you to turn it off because not every plugin does. And then the one below it is on the mellow piano preset, also with the release turned down a bit. So here's what the first one sounds like. Very soft, very warm. And the one below that, more of a traditional like Juno piano vibe. And here's what everything we have so far sounds like. Sounds so nice and 80s. Then we have the bass. For this, I wanted to get that sort of 80s P-bass vibe, but still have that sort of modern control with it. Honestly, a lot of like the basic stuff in Guitar Rig 6 for bass is pretty awesome. Then using a little bit of this DI feeder preset, which I modified a lot. High passing it and then doing some cuts with the kick and the snare, just because I feel like those elements are like kind of the main point of the track. Messing around with a bunch of different compressors, I figured I would try this one out since I don't have as much experience with it yet. You can see it's not really doing a whole lot of compression. Using a couple instances of R bass, because with these cuts, I kind of felt like they were lacking in these ranges still. And then something that I stole from my buddy Johnny is using Bass Rider Live to sort of level it out. Not the same way that a compressor would like compress a signal, but it will like dynamically look at the bass and like pull things down. just makes it super consistent. And then I have another EQ here. Felt like there was a little bit too much mid-range honkiness after everything here, and a weird low-end thing that I wanted to change. And then we have the soothe sidechain to the kick, so it's pulling down this fundamental of the kick drum out of the bass every time the kick hits. And I only did that on the bass because all of these other mid-range instruments that we've had up to this point, they're actually in a group where I have an instance of C4 that's like taming the mid-range a bit, because all of this mid-range can be very overwhelming if it's not controlled properly. And then we have a couple of compressors, one side chain to the kick and one side chain to the snare. And so everything kind of moves out of the way of the kick and snare, but with the bass, it's really only that like low frequency in the kick that's getting pulled out. I didn't want it to have that like pumping feeling, because I feel like when I add that sidechain effect to the bass, that's when that pumping feeling really gets accentuated. So here's everything we have so far. Next, we have the drums. For this one, I'm using a heavily affected version of the Tony Royster Jr. kit from Mixwave, just on the default kit. Mainly modifying it with this RC20 because the drums in the 1975 song are kind of vintage disco-y, and this kit was a little bit too clean and modern. After that, did some cuts, specifically in this range between the kick and the snare. I believe the snare's around here and the kick's around here, and there was this weird frequency happening. Tiny boost in the high end, and then ran it into the tiniest amount of MoTT. Just because whenever I run stuff through MoTT, it tends to balance out the sound a lot, acts a little bit like a heavy-handed compressor, but there's an amount knob so you can get a little bit more control over it. But then also it tightens up the mid-range, tightens up the low end, and adds a little bit of high-end excitement, and all that stuff is really good. And these guys are doing the most basic disco drum beat ever. This is almost like the Billie Jean beat, and the only difference is when it goes to the chorus, it goes to an open hi-hat and a 4 in the floor kick. And after listening to the original, I'm not even sure that he opens the hi-hat that much. I just felt like I needed that energy. But then, yeah, here we have the snare and the kick below it for the sidechaining stuff. As you can see, they're not really coming through the mix at all. Then we just have some percussion layers and sound effects. So we have this guy here. I just felt like it needed some kind of like disco style percussion loop, some pretty heavy-handed MoTT. And if it's an element like this where I don't really need any low-end information, I'll actually normally pull down the lows. But yeah, this guy is just adding like a fun like filler excitement thing. And again, like I did on the last 1975 video, I love using one knob pumper from waves to sort of dynamically bring percussion in and out without necessarily having to automate it. It just kind of gives it like a good little 16th note thing happening. And the best layer ever, we have a cowbell, and it's literally just one sample of a cowbell that's hitting on that offbeat, but it genuinely adds so much to the drums. So like it's not insignificant. That like upbeat actually makes it substantial. And then similar to Happiness, we have some wind chimes going into some reverb as sort of like a trail after that crash, which is down here. Just clap impact. So here's all the drums and percussion. And that's everything. We're just going to look at the mastering chain real quick, because unlike normally on this channel, I did not just use my default preset for this one. Like I used it as a starting point, but I did a lot of weird stuff. So I have the tiniest amount, like literally 2% of this VHS preset on the master, because it's just, this track sounds disco, vintage, 80s. It does not sound modern and clean. So I just felt like adding this color on the out, it just fit. And every time I turned it off, it just felt wrong. And then this is probably one of the biggest examples of do as I say, not as I do, because I really wanted to match the tonality of the original master. And so I ended up doing these pretty big high shelf and low shelf cuts. And I ended up even low passing the high end of this. So here's with it off. Here's with it on. It's degrading the high end a lot. And if I wasn't trying to match it exactly to the other mix, I may not do something like this. Like this is almost a 3 dB cut on a shelf, but I really wanted to make sure I was matching the original sound. For compression, I wanted to mess around with stuff I had never done before, so I tried this solid bus compressor from Native Instruments, and I kind of enjoy it. Yeah, I might mess around with it more next time. I messed around a bit with this linear phase multiband preset called Uncompress, where it's essentially expanding up instead of compressing down. And the thought process that that I had with this is that this is kind of like leveling things out a little bit, bringing them up. And then this is just kind of the tiniest bit of reinforcement on the kick and the snare. Use some Fab Filter Saturn. Mids are really distorted. Highs are not as distorted. Some stereo enhancement after that. And then a couple of limiters to bring it up to about 10 LUFS. I didn't feel like going as heavy-handed with it. And then I just double-checked stuff with tonal balance. But yeah, let's listen to what the final track sounds like. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you like it, please hit subscribe and like and all those things below. Again, I do one of these videos every Friday. So if this is the kind of content that you enjoy, go ahead and follow. And yeah, I will see you guys next week.